The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseWare continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseWare at ocw.mit.edu.
What stresses you? You don't have to divulge something deeply personal, but in a general way, what stresses people? Lack of sleep. Yeah, lack of sleep's a pretty good stressor. Exams and stuff like that, grades, stuff like that. What else? So let's make up some things. Exams and grades if you're a student, right? Deadlines of any kind throughout your life will stress you. Traffic, you know, when you're trying to get to the airport to make that flight or trying to get to your job interview and traffic is twice as bad as you thought and somebody in front of you seems to be driving exceptionally slowly. Sometimes family relationships, I think even in happy families, there's points of stress in terms of how different views are dealt with. Maybe if you're a college student, what the rest of your life will be like, you know, where it's not 4 years all set out in front of you approximately, right, but like what the rest of your life will be about and mean. That can be stress if people talk too much to you about that. What does not stress you compared to what we might imagine throughout evolutions was stressful for mammals like us? You're mostly not worrying about being eaten or eating another person for dinner, right? Okay? I mean, that's not an everyday stress for you, but that's an everyday stress for mammals who are trying to survive because of the food of another group, right? And trying to get their own food to live. So the kinds of stresses we now have in an industrialized economy or a post-industrial economy is incredibly different than the stressors that occurred for most of our evolution. And I'm going to take a lot of these points from a wonderful book from a wonderful researcher and writer, Robert Sapolsky, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. But he asks, in that sense, what stresses a zebra? They're not worried about exams and deadlines and MCATs and things like this, right? Okay, what are the forms of stress that they face? And there's things like serious physical injury, predators, and starvation. You know, very fundamental things about living, surviving, and not careers, jobs, timetables, the kind of world we mostly live in, unless we have a health threat. And so what's stress? It's a psychological and physiological response to a stimulus, a stressor, that alters the body's equilibrium. And when we talk about stress, we can talk about two forms of it: acute, what's instantaneous, and chronic, what's consistent and goes on. So acute physical stress would be an injury. A chronic, things are hunger or cancer, long-term problems. An acute psychological stress would be a deadline. A chronic one would be chronic work pressure if you have that, throughout the semester. An acute stressor socially is humiliation. A chronic one might be isolation, right? And we'll come back a little bit, actually, to social rejection as a stressor later on. So Sapolsky's idea is this, that for animals in the wilderness, and for us maybe for a long time in evolution, stress is typically acute, physical, and responsive. Something dangerous happens, it's about your bodily survival, and then you act. For people in the world we live in this room, stress is often chronic. Psychosocial, it's not a physical threat mostly that's happening to you. It's something about your sense of yourself in the world, how you relate to people, how you relate to your goals. And it's anticipatory. A huge amount, we talked about it for pleasure also, the anticipation of reward we talked about turns on your dopamine system once you know what the reward will be, not the reward itself. But when it comes to fearful things, we also know that we can have dread. We dread upcoming things for quite some time before they even got here, if we think they're going to be pretty unpleasant. And there's a neat study from Greg Burns about the neurobiology of dread in people. So it's an fMRI study, and in a way that was approved by human subjects, they were waiting for a cutaneous electrical shock to the foot. So it's a shock that's enough to be unpleasant, but not enough to be dangerous. And people signed up voluntarily to do it. And at each trial, as you sit in the scanner, you're told what's the voltage level going to be compared to the most unpleasant they use in that experiment, and how long until it comes. So the voltage is, how painful it's going to be. The duration of time is something about how long dread can develop in anticipation of a painful stimulus. And at first, you just got the warning, and here comes the pain. After a while, you get a choice, and this is the interesting thing. Would you rather get, for example, and you could think about this, 90% voltage, that is 9/10 as bad as the whole experiment ever has it, in 3 seconds, so something pretty painful pretty fast, or would you rather have 60% voltage in 27 seconds? So you can decide for yourself, which would you rather have? And you can see they're trading off in people's choices the actual physical pain, which is greater than the 90%, versus the period of dread, the anticipation of something miserable coming up, in the case where it's less pain but a longer run-up. And what they found is that people varied in interesting ways, and they found some brain correlates of this. But they found that what they call the extreme dreaders, that they would prefer more voltage now than to wait for any shock later on. Like, get it over with now, okay? It's more painful for me to sit there and wait for something, even though there's no painful stimulus, than to just get it over with now. And maybe we all know the relief that when we anticipate something bad, having it happen sometimes is almost a relief to be past all that miserable dread. So where in the brain does some of this occur? So one area that we'll come back to, a couple of different areas, but one area I want to focus on is this middle of the brain, this area called the cingulate. And here, regardless of time, and in all subjects, the more voltage you got, the bigger the brain response. Okay, that's not very surprising. It's in a part of the brain, we'll come to this a little bit later, that's involved in the interpretation of pain. The more voltage you get, it's easy to interpret it as worse. And then they said, what's the difference in the people who are the extreme dreaders, the people who would say, no matter how bad the pain, I would rather have it now than wait for a lesser pain for a few more seconds, okay? Give me the worst now, I have to get it over with. And what they found in the brains of those individuals, showed in red in this figure, is that even before anything was coming on, in these same brain areas that responded to the pain, there was a rise in activation as if the pain was already happening, right? The same areas that are involved in responding to the pain, especially in the people who dreaded it the most, who would take more pain now to avoid the wait, those parts of the brain are already showing a pain-like response before anything has arrived, a physical manifestation of dread. So let's go back to mortality for a moment. So in 1900, think about this, what were the major causes of death in the United States? And they were mostly from infectious disease and childbirth. Childbirth was extremely dangerous in 1900. So the most common causes of death were pneumonia, tuberculosis. If you know about this, it won't surprise you, but if you haven't studied this in history recently, influenza flu. In 1918, it killed more Americans than World War I, which was high at that year, okay? It was killing many, many people. And childbirth, and especially, of course, that's going to be in young women. How about a few years ago in 2007, which is roughly now, how many people are dying of these things? Not so many in the United States. They're dying of diseases that are conceptualized as cumulative damage diseases, not an infection, but things like heart disease, where over many years, a combination of lifestyle and stress might harm your heart function, might promote the growth of cancer, might promote the stroke or cerebrovascular disorders, including stroke. And many of these diseases are viewed as a combination of long-term lifestyle things, maybe an exposure to toxins in the environment, and some mixtures of those. Not a one-time, one-shot infection or child delivery, but long, slow processes that finally culminate in mortality. So many of our current ideas about stress come from a researcher named Hans Selye, and in the 1930s, it turns out he's one of the main people in thinking about stress as an important thing in our life, but he was infamously not good for his handling of rats in the laboratory. Now, have any of you handled rats in a laboratory by your hands? I see one hand going up there. Any others? Okay. How easy is it to handle them when you pick them up and do stuff? Are they like, thank you very much, I knew it was time for injection or time for feeding or whatever you do with them? No? Are they kind of squirreling around a lot and wiggling and not very happy when you pick them up on the whole? About as happy as we would be if a giant picked us up and shook us and injected us with the stuff for the day, okay? All right, yeah, I was only involved in one rat experiment ever, and you know, I can't claim to be a great like Celia, but I can claim to be as bad as he was with handling rats, because it was kind of scary. They were like really mean and want to get out of your hand. Of course, from their perspective, they're just trying to live the life they were meant to lead. And you're fighting with them, and you're forcing them this thing and that thing to get injected, and you know, they're squirreling around. Okay. So anyway, so he's doing an experiment where they were extracted ovarian chemical, and they were trying to figure out what it does at the time, and he injected the rats daily. And he was pretty bad, by his own admission. He would drop them on the floor. They would scurry behind, you know, tables. He would hunt them down and drag them out. And he would do this day in, day out for months, because they were on a daily experimental schedule. And what he found after months of this sort of inadvertent, nonstop stressing of the rats, because of course the better thing to do if you're skilled is just pick them up with authority, inject them, and put them back, right? So all the fighting and stuff from the poor handling is not making them any happier. What he found in them is peptic ulcers, ulcers in their eating system, enlarged adrenal glands, shrunken tissue, immune tissue. But it wasn't about the ovarian chemical. It was also in his control rats. Basically, he was giving all of them stress-induced physiological changes. And what he was impressed by, and many other people too, is that you can expose rats to a whole huge range of stressors, different things you do in their environment, and they all seem to converge on these ulcers, these enlarged adrenal glands, and shrunken immune tissue. A lot of different things that can stress you seem to converge upon a common biological pathway and consequences for the animal. So stress response is similar in a broad array of stressors, and if they go on for too long, people get sick, the chronic stress. So you remember from your introductory biology courses and so on that when we talk about the autonomic nervous system in people, there's a sympathetic and a parasympathetic branch. The sympathetic goes from the brain to the spine, to organs, to blood vessels, to sweat glands, to muscles and hairs. That's why you get goosebumps when you're scared. That's the nerves, you know, innervating that's when your hair stands on end. It turns out for emergency situations, arousal, activation. The famous joke that it gives, it's related to the 4 Fs, flight, fright, and sex. I couldn't quite, I was so afraid I'd mess it up that I couldn't read the 4 words. Flight, fright, fight, and sex. And it releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. That's the same thing as adrenaline or noradrenaline. One's English-American, one's American-American, the same things. The parasympathetic is your, you know, Zen couch potato system. It operates highly when you're asleep or you're eating or you're relaxing. And so you can talk about different organs and how they're responding to the two kinds of systems. When one is up and one is down, they're sort of in mutual opposition or balance. So in the heart, when you're sympathetic, when you have to activate and run from being attacked, your heart rate speeds up. Your parasympathetic system would turn it down. For the blood, it's speeded to muscles, and when you're in sympathetic action, and when you're in parasympathetic relaxation, it's drawn from the muscles to other organs. Part of that response, too, is the hypothalamus, which releases corticotropin-releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary. In about 15 seconds, that releases ACTH into the blood. That reaches the kidney, and a few minutes later, that produces glucocorticoids or steroids or cortisol that's often used as a marker for a stress response. So a sort of brain to hypothalamus to pituitary to kidney circuit. And then one can talk about how what can be an adaptive response in an acute emergency can become maladaptive if it's chronic and happens over and over again. So mobilization of energy, good when you're escaping danger, but if you have it all the time, maybe it leads to muscle weakness, myopathy, fatigue, or diabetes. Increased cardiovascular tone, you know, good for escaping danger. Stress-induced hypertension, not good. Suppression of digestion, you know, you don't want to start to spend energy on digestion when you're running for your life. But if you suppress it too much, it's associated with ulceration and colitis. Suppression of growth will come to that if you're in a growth period of your life. That's metabolically expensive to do growth, okay? You turn off growth mechanisms briefly when you're in sympathetic action. Reproduction is turned off or down. Too much of that, amenorrhea, impotency, loss of libido. Suppression of the immune system. Again, you're turning down energy spent on immune processes temporarily for an emergency. Too much of that, and you could have increased disease risk. Sharpening of cognition. You want to be as smart as you can be, right, under dangerous circumstances. Sort of having your system in high gear all the time can lead to neuronal death, and I'll show you an example of hippocampal shrinkage that occurs with stress in that way. So everything that can be adaptive in one hand can be related to stress-related disorders on the other hand in the heart or in the arteries. And here's a picture of a stomach ulcer. We'll come back to that because the ulcer is one of the great interesting stories of the second half of last century, is the complete reinterpretation of why people get ulcers. So let's talk about that now. So the adaptive response, when you're in an emergency, is to suppress digestion. That's part of the sympathetic response. And stress has long been associated with getting ulcers, which are holes in the wall of your organ. Now, for many, many, many years, physicians and scientists thought that getting ulcers in adults was associated with a combination of stress and diet. And people who had ulcers were told, try to have less stress in your life and eat more bland food. And then Robert Warren and Barry Marshall won the Nobel Prize in 2005. But this is one of those stories in science where everybody literally ridiculed these people. At conferences and in papers, they were literally ridiculed by the entire orthodox scientific field because they put forth the idea, which had been around a little bit, but they really pushed it, that this was due not to the combination of diet and stress, but it was due to an actual specific bacterium. And people thought that's ridiculous because our stomachs are so acidic that no bacterium would survive in the acidic environment of our stomachs long enough to do any harm in this sort of chronic way. And part of the way, as they struggled to get data, they did these kind of funny experiments where Marshall went and took the bacterium they suspected and actually swallowed it and to see what would happen, okay? This kind of weird, heroic, self-medical experiment. And he thought, like in 10 years, I'll see if I have an ulcer. But what happened is within a couple of days, he was having severe gastritis, a severe disturbance of the stomach. And that was the first piece of evidence they could do to, he couldn't find out if he would have an ulcer in the long run because his wife made him take medications right away after that. So, but still that built up the case that it's a bacterium that's swallowed that causes the gastritis that leads to ulcers. And that if you give people antibiotic treatments that will treat the bacterium, they improve a lot. So a complete re-understanding of what causes this disorder and how to treat it. So some people say, well, it was never about stress. It was always about the bacterium. That's it. It's a simple biological story. But there's two ways in which probably stress is relevant. One of them, the milder one, is that about 15% of cases of ulcer don't have any measurable bacterium. They don't seem to have that. Okay, so who knows about that 15%. But here's the more amazing piece. Many, many, many of us have this bacterium. It's an incredibly common, widespread bacterium. But only 10% of the people who have the bacterium have ulcers. Okay? So it seems like it's not just about having the bacterium, but it's an interaction, perhaps, between the bacterium and the stressors of your environment. There's not many stories about suppression of growth, but there's one sort of historically interesting one. So this is, at the edge of science, is an anecdote, and I'll show you a clinical case. You can't do many experiments about this, about what's called psychogenic dwarfism, an inability to get to standard height that's thought to be based on psychological principles. So this is a story of a British Victorian family. Their favorite son was killed at age 13, a tragic loss of a son. The bereaved mother takes to her bed. For years, she didn't leave her room or bed. And she ignores her surviving 6-year-old son, constantly idealizing the boy who had passed away and having almost no interest in the surviving son. And when he would come into the room, bringing her food to her room, and she'd lay in her bed in severe depression, she would say to him, "David," that's the boy who passed away, "Oh, David, is that you? Oh, it's only you," she would say to the surviving son. So depressed and discounting her surviving son. David was always perfect. The surviving son was a sort of irritating reminder. He grew to only 5 feet as an adult, and he's famous for writing the play Peter Pan. So the next time you see the play or see the movie, think about what childhood means to a person who had this kind of childhood and grew to a very short stature in what's interpreted as a psychological response to a long period of stress, the lack of sort of attachment from his mother. And here's a clinical case of a child who went into a hospital. You can see this picture of this child growing. He was obviously in a non-supportive environment. He enters the hospital, and his growth hormone levels is 5.9. It's very low. He takes to a nurse. At 100 days later, it goes to 13. It more than doubles. He's gaining height considerably. The nurse goes on vacation. He goes back to his low levels of growth hormone and growth. She returns, and he goes back to a sort of typical growth of height. So very psychological relationship between his physical growth and his relationship to the nurse. And so we understand this to be extreme cases of emotional neglect or something like that in the homes. These are not small spats with your parents. But again, a relationship between a very chronic stress, an emotional one, and physical growth. Now, this is a famous chair, and the story goes like this. In the mid-1950s, Meyer Friedman and Ray Rosenman were cardiologists on the West Coast, and they had a cardiology practice. And they had a chair, and this is the chair, that sat in their waiting room. And they had a guy who came in whose name is lost to history, although everybody agrees he gets credit for beginning this idea. And his job was to reupholster the chairs. And he told these two physicians, you know, I go to a lot of places and I work in a lot of offices, and nowhere do I go do I have to reupholster chairs as often as I do in your office. Okay? And this triggered a thought in these two people, because don't forget that you know, for many physicians, understandably, and maybe less so now, you know, like, you know, cardiology is like real biology, and psychological stuff is kind of peripheral and edgy, right? Maybe not really matter, okay? So, to Friedman and Rosenman's credit, they said, like, what is going on? Why does our chairs look like this? Now, have you ever, you know, sometimes you might have that experience yourself. Have you ever stood in line in a way that's unbelievably irritating? So you have somewhere to go, and there's somebody really slow in front of you, or somebody working the line who's really slow, and you're going, come on, I have minutes to go here. Can't I get my coffee or my tea or whatever? You know, have you ever seen people jump from line to line in grocery stores because they cannot bear, they dread that moment when they get somebody who gets into the line where you're supposed to have 10 items and they have 12? Have you seen, so, you know, none of us think that's quite fair play, but some of us say, okay, you know, wish they had 10 items, right? And some people are really mad, right? Okay. So that's type A personality, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And what they began to say is the patients are sitting in the office fidgeting, like, where's the doctor? Where's the doctor? I have important things to do, okay? And they're wearing down the arms and the chair because they're so fidgety waiting for that appointment to happen. You know, not just for one moment, but for a long time, and they're literally wearing down the chair. And they're showing up at a high rate to a cardiology practice of people with heart problems. And that's developed this idea that a huge threat, and I'll qualify this in a moment with subsequent studies, but in the 1960s, that type A personalities, so you've heard that phrase, perhaps, type A personalities. This is where that began. That's become a widespread term. These are people who are immensely competitive, overachieving, time-pressured, impatient, hostile, and they have increased risks of cardiovascular disease. In their first analyses, the risk, if you had this kind of personality, was equal to smoking or very high cholesterol. I mean, it was a very high risk. And that's why these chairs were being worn down by the type A personalities showing up with cardiac problems because they were stressing themselves all the time by everyday life events. And this picture is kind of, they had anecdotal things. They had a early morning group, a patient support group of type A individuals with cardiovascular disease, like to get together and say, okay, you know, when I'm really stressed out, I'm going to count to 5 and relax, right? It was a support group. So here are their cars. Now, when you go park your car sometimes, you know, there's some people, depending on the situation, who park forward into their spot. But if you know you have to get away super fast and you don't have a minute to waste, how do you park? You park backwards, right? So when you jump into your car, you can hit that accelerator and you're out, you know, 2 seconds. So all of the type A people are all lined up here, ready to race their way out after the session. And here's the middle of the day mixed parking, okay? You know, some people front end in, some people rear ended, right? Okay, but it's anecdotal, but this is the kind of things they were noticing that led to these ideas. So it turns out in subsequent studies that a lot of the effect wasn't as broad as they thought, but it does apply to people who are relatively young with cardiovascular problems. And the key psychological aspect is not the impatience and aggressiveness, although if you work for somebody like that, you don't enjoy that probably. But the key thing is whether the person feels in themselves hostility, not impatience, but hostility, and especially when they suppress it. Like they go, I'm so mad, I'm so mad, I'm so mad, but I can't, really hit the person in front of the line. And that person brewing with hostility and suppressing that rage is actually pushing up the risk of cardiovascular disorder. So again, we talked about adaptive stress responses, and for practically every one of them, what can be understood to be a stress-related disease when that form of stress continues chronically and unabated. And here's a picture of a neuron in a healthy animal with lots of dendrites and arborization, and the withered neuron in a hippocampal animal given lots of stress in laboratory experiments. So you can see it at the neuronal level, you can see the behavioral level, you can see it at the disease level. The stress, chronic stress is toxic in many ways. So one form of stress that occurs after really terrible experiences is post-traumatic stress disorder. And you may have heard, where do you hear these days most of all about post-traumatic stress disorder?
Wars?
The wars, right? The unabated wars in the Middle East for American soldiers going over there under many tours of duty, under constant fear of explosion, for the civilian populations in those parts of the world under nonstop war and threat for many, many years. So if you did a brutal, vicious experiment of people under constant threat for their life, unfortunately, you couldn't create probably a more perfect one than the Middle East for both soldiers and civilians for the last decade, right? Constant threat and danger for people everywhere all the time. I was reading a story about one soldier, for example, civilians as well, who was standing in line to get his toothpaste. IED blows up and he loses his leg. That's what the life is like for those soldiers. And as you know, because in the U.S., we have a volunteer army, soldiers are sent again and again for years, altogether. And the civilians living there all the time, that's the world they're in. So brutal stress induction. And just a few months ago, the number of American soldiers who died from suicide is now on a monthly basis exceeding those who die from war injuries. Think about that. The number of active American soldiers who die from suicide is equal to or higher in many months nowadays than the number who die from war consequences of bombs and things like that. So there's a lot of interest in PTSD from the war, for civilians being exposed to the war, and then from individuals who have brutal episodes in their lives, tragically, of assault or rape. So severe anxiety disorder that can develop after exposure to any event which results in psychological trauma. People re-experience the original trauma through flashbacks, dreams, increased arousal, hypervigilance. And it's very common for anybody who goes through an emotionally brutal experience, and it persists strongly in what's estimated about 20% of people who go through something like that. So people have tried to understand what is the brain basis of PTSD? Who's at risk for it? And how does it happen in the brain in a way that treatments might become more effective to help people? So one thing that was observed, and not everybody gets this finding, is that individuals with smaller volumes of the hippocampus, that when they look at soldiers with PTSD, they tend to have smaller hippocampal volumes. So let's ask the question, how could this be a cause, or how could this be a consequence of a severely traumatic experience you have, like serving in a particularly brutal and nasty war, or being a civilian one? But these are soldier studies, so we'll focus on that. How could you tell? They come back from the war, they have PTSD, they have smaller hippocampi. Was that a risk factor for becoming somebody with PTSD into a high-stress situation? Or was it the way that the war situation made you have PTSD? Is it the cause or the consequence? Does that make sense? Okay. So here's an approach that people have taken. They did a twin study, and I'll show you the graph in a moment, where one twin, this was for Vietnam now, went to serve in Vietnam, and one twin did not serve in the military at all. And these are identical twins. And then they asked, is the hippocampus smaller in the twin who never went? And the logic was, and it's not it's not a complete certainty, but the logic is, if the twin who stays home in the U.S. also has a smaller hippocampus, that suggests that it's a risk factor for PTSD rather than the way that PTSD develops in the brain. Does that make sense? It might also play a role in that, but it's present even before that. And that's exactly what they found. This graph, I have to get the projector fixed. But there's two steep lines here on your notes, you'll see. They're both pretty steep. The top one is the correlation between severity of PTSD in the soldiers who went and hippocampal volume, and the bottom one's hippocampal volume, and they're twins who didn't go, and they look incredibly similar. That is, the larger your hippocampus of either the twin who went to war or the twin who stayed home, the larger of either one correlated with the PTSD in the twin who went to war. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's as if the genetic influence or the early environmental influence at home, or both, if you have a smaller hippocampus, you're at higher risk for PTSD. Now, if you're not sent into war, you won't necessarily get PTSD. But if you're sent into war, then you're at high risk for getting PTSD. Is that okay? So more recently, people have begun to do pre-post studies. And this is one done in the Israeli military. 50 recruits, before and after they did military service as paramedics. And what they found was that there was increased stress associated with greater amygdala and hippocampal response, fMRI, to stress-related content. That the amygdala reactivity before stress-related contact predicted how many stress symptoms you have, and the hippocampus change over time correlated with stress symptoms. So now this goes a little bit differently. It says the amygdala function predicts who's at risk for having PTSD, and that the hippocampal changes over time before and after your initial service go with the degree to which you exhibit the PTSD. I'll just say that. So there's been a lot of work on understanding what can positively modify stress. You know, what can you do, given stress you can't avoid, to do better and cope better with that? What can be the sources of resilience? And I'm going to give you examples, but I'm going to tell you the following. These are the categories that have come up in pretty well-controlled studies. Outlets for frustration. If you have a good outlet for frustration, that diminishes the toxic effects of stress. If you can predict bad things and feel you have control, even if you have bad things happen, you can cope with the consequences better. We talked about that in learned helplessness before. This is sort of theme before. If things seem to be getting better, even if they're pretty bad, if they seem to be getting better, that's a huge source of resilience. And social support is very powerful. So let me show you the empirical evidence for these things. So here's a study where rats received shocks. They had a prolonged stress response because they're in a situation of getting shocks and shocks and shocks. Heart rate goes up, glucocorticoid secretion goes up, high rate of ulcers. Now you have other rats getting a similar thing, but they can gnaw on a wooden bar or eat or drink or run on a wheel. So they have outlets for frustration. It doesn't prevent the shocks. It's just after they get a shock, they'll go for a quick, angry run on the wheel, okay? Or they'll bite on something, okay? And they have fewer ulcers. So just having an outlet for frustration reduces the toxic effects. Even another rat in the cage that they can go and bite helps, okay? Now, that's not a nice thing for the other rat, but it's just like, you know, this common thing that we have, it's not the best human trait, but this is an example, or rat trait. There's an example that, you know, if somebody is as miserable as you feel better about things, okay? Baboons will attack bystanders after losing a fight. So baboons are, depending on where they are in their hierarchy, you know, the alpha male and so on down, they lose a fight, they get themselves healthier in terms of glucocorticoids if after they lose a fight they go beat up a lower ranking baboon, okay? Now, we're not recommending that as a nice way to behave, but we're just saying, weirdly enough, these kinds of actions, some outlet for frustration, some are more constructive than others, result in resilience in these animals, fewer ulcers, lowering of glucocorticoids. So some kind of outlet for stress. How about predictability and control? So if rats hear a warning before a shock, even though they get an equal number of shocks, they have fewer ulcers. So as long as they can know the shock is coming, you know, it's pretty, they have all the dread of that too, but they feel like, I know what's going on, and that literally results in fewer ulcers. If food is delivered to a rat at intermittent intervals they can't predict, versus randomly, no, sorry, they can, versus random delivery, they're more stressed with the random delivery. Again, prediction, equal amount of food, but if they can predict it, they feel like they know what's going on. Rats are given a lever to avoid the shock. even if the lever is disconnected to the shocks, the stress response is reduced, right? So it's kind of an outlet too. Like, here's a lever I'm pushing. It doesn't do anything, but they feel like, who knows, you know? I mean, I feel like I have some control. Same thing with people. They did experiments where they give them noxious noises, and one person has a button to stop the noise. They're less hypertensive, whether the button is pressed or not. So they don't even have to press, but if they feel like they might have control, that's already a protective measure for stress. And there's famous studies looking at occupational stress because some jobs have very high demand and low control. The most famous one that I know of is from pilots in World War II in the British Air Force. And they compared the pilot who sat up front and rode the plane versus the gunner. You know, if you think of those airplanes from books or movies, you know, there's a little turret down and there's a gunner shooting at the other planes that are shooting back at him. Does he feel like he has any control? No. I mean, wherever the pilot's going, he's going, no, don't go there, don't go there. The other's shooting at him, right? So, and then they look at the life expectancy and health of the people, and the pilots did a lot better than the gunners, okay, after the war, because the gunners just went out day in, day out, and they just went wherever the pilot took them, and the shots were coming out. And so everybody was at risk, but the pilots felt they had control, and the gunners felt they had no control. So many different examples. Here's a very famous one, and I read somewhere they're making a movie of this, although I don't know exactly how they'll make it compelling, but here we go. So this is a study from Judy Roden and Ellen Langer where they looked at the sense of predictability in a nursing home. And they took people out randomly assigned from randomly selected different floors. And group A in the nursing home got to make many decisions for themselves. They got to decide where to receive their visitors, when to watch a movie, what houseplant to take care of. They all took care of a houseplant. These are sort of minor things, but you know, people in a nursing home don't have a huge range of things they can control anyway. But they took these things they could put under their control. And Group B got no instructions to make decisions. They got a plant, but the staff took care of the plant. So everybody gets a plant, right? But one group, they're saying, make the decisions you can for yourself. And the other group, sort of the nurses and doctors did all the decisions they could for those individuals. They looked at what happened 1.5 years later after this. Not only did Group A, the people who were making decisions for themselves in the nursing home, report themselves to be more cheerful, more active, and alert, they were also objectively healthier, and kind of amazingly, only half as many had died, literally died. So it's an extremely compelling. I've shown you so many sources of evidence, from controlled animal things to anecdotal things to kind of a controlled experiment with humans of random assignment here, where the sense that a person has control is incredibly powerful, not only for their happiness, but it literally seems to fight off stress-related diseases in their body, in their hearts, and their life expectancy. Now, the psychological modifiers of the stress response, you know, will vary depending on who you are and the culture you're in. I'm going to just show you one experiment about that. We'll talk a little bit later about different cultures. But here's one about what counts as predictability and control, because it'll vary by culture. And so we'll talk more about this in social psychology, but social psychologists like to talk about one sort of giant distinction around the world as a simplifying way of organizing a huge complexity of cultures. Individualist cultures and collectivist cultures. Individualist cultures tend to emphasize the individual. Be yourself. Be all that you can be. Okay, you're the one. You're the special person. That's thought to be, you know, common as a cultural sort of mode in the US and the Europe. Over time, just in the last decade, people decided the US is like way, way out of control, different than the rest of the world in this, okay? In the US, we send this message to everybody. The way to be happy and successful is to be super individualistic. Europe, a little less so, right? And that other cultures, Japan, South Korea, China have received a lot of attention. In East Asia, tend to be more like we're in this together. Now, this is super simplifying, okay, over many people, many situations. But cultures do send messages. Where you grow up, everything from your household to the town you're in, the school you're in, the country you're in, they send you messages of ways to be, right? I mean, we live in that. And here's an example, an experiment that shows, depending on the cultural influences, roughly speaking, averaging out across people and families, you can view one thing or another as a better control or a better, healthier, happier control. So here's the experiment. And there's a bunch like these, but this is one. In elementary school, I think it was in San Francisco, 7 to 9-year-olds who were either from Asian American families or Anglo-American families. So that's the cultural thing now, trying to look at this cultural versus individualist. Parenthetically, Asian American families in the US are probably somewhere in between, Asian families in Asia and Anglo-American families in the US, right? Probably somewhere in between. So anyway, so they did an experiment with Miss Smith, the teacher, and she had 6 markers and 6 piles of anagrams, and you got to pick, somebody got to pick which anagrams you would work on to do your best and solve. Okay, so a typical school little exercise, you're trying to do well. And they divided all these children into 3 groups. In one group, the children chose which anagrams they would do. In one group, the teacher chose it. And in one, they said, we've communicated with your mother, and she says this is the anagram set for you. Okay, so you could think in your own life, if you arrived to class tomorrow at MIT, and people told you, here's a problem set. You pick the problems, I pick the problems, or I emailed your mother, and she said, you should really try those problems, okay? Well, you're older. You wouldn't, okay, you'd be weirded out, right? But, okay. But, 7 to 9-year-olds, they sort of take that, right? All right. Here's the interesting thing. So we're going to talk about performance on the anagrams, because this is actual performance, what seems like a self-control thing. For the children who are from Anglo-American families, they perform best when they picked the anagram set. The anagram sets were all equal in difficulty. It's just like, I picked it, I know what I'm doing, okay? 4 times better than the teacher, and 2.5 times better than when the mother picked. That is, there's something about picking that set that makes them feel like that's the right set for them, and they perform best, all right? For the children from Asian American families, on average, they perform best when the mother had selected the anagram set. 30% better than themselves, and twice as well as the teacher. So all this is saying is culture influences all of us in various ways, in complicated ways. This is one of the easiest things to identify is this kind of a cultural difference. But the important thing is it's psychological what you perceive as a source of control, right? So the way we interpret this is for children who are exposed heavily to an Anglo-American emphasis on independent selfness, you're the one, you believe you'll do best, the most control is exerted when you choose. And for these, apparently for these Asian American children, they feel the best control has been exerted, when their mother has selected for them the anagram they're most likely to succeed on. And the performance goes with that belief for both groups of children. I always worry about these things, and we're going to talk a little bit more about stereotypes because sometimes you feel like you're supporting stereotypes, but these are real studies. It didn't have to play out that way. It's obviously, doesn't say that every Anglo-American is this way and every Asian American is that way, but cultures do influence us. Otherwise, we think that the other choice is cultures don't influence us, and all the data is that culture matters, the world we grow up in, the values we're exposed to. Okay, here's another kind of brutal experiment about sense of control from 1957. I mean, this is truly life and death. So they were interested in understanding really about for survival in animals, for water temperature and endurance. And they put the rats in a jar and they asked, brutally, how long does the rat swim before it drowns? Okay? This is as brutal an experiment as you can have. And the goal of it was more to understand things about temperature and whether people could survive different temperatures. It wasn't just to be mean to rats. Okay, this was the science goal was to understand thermal survival for people in the long run. But one thing they noticed was this. Some rats gave up in about 15 minutes. Others would struggle as long as possible and would go for an hour before they gave up. Some would surrender quickly, and some would fight as long as a rat can possibly fight, okay? Now, what's the difference between those rats who, give up early? Yeah? 60 hours. I'm sorry, it is 60 hours, okay? Yeah, it's fantastic. I'm sorry. Yes, you're right. I missaid that because, yes, that's correct. Okay, thank you. Huge, okay? And yeah, 60 hours. There we go. It is hours. Okay, thank you. Yeah, is that unbelievable? But for life and death, you might do that. For life and death? Like what else? You can't do anything else. Yeah. I know, it's kind of amazing. I mean, what's amazing to them is not necessarily the 60 hours, which is pretty impressive itself. It's that some just gave up really fast, and some just went as long, as you could go before you would expire, no matter what. And what they did is this. They did an experiment. This is a little bit like the Celia experiment, but on purpose. Before they put the rats into here, they picked up the rats, they let them wiggle around, and they would put them in and out of the water. And then they would put them in this fatal final experiment. And then practically all of the rats went for the 60 hours of effort. Why? The interpretation, I mean, you can't really know. You can't ask the rat, right? But the interpretation is they went in and out, they went in and out, they struggled. They had hope. Literally, as far as we can understand, they had hope. Because before they were taken out, okay? And if you have hope, you struggle for a long, long time. And if you're hopeless for some reason, if you don't have hope, you give up fast. So it's very compelling that this sense of self-control, including hope, makes tremendous difference in performance. And is very psychologically malleable in people, what counts for them as sources of hope and control. How about social support? So in primates, after a stress response, among strangers, they're worse. If they're among animals they know, they're better. And this is measured by glucocorticoids. There's an objective measure in monkeys that they're better if they're among monkeys they know. So you can think in your own life, family, friends, intuitively, is it better? Are they sources of support? And yes. So people, they do stressor experiments with people. A really good one is to tell somebody they're about to do a public speaking task that turns out to scare people, or a difficult math task, or they're about to argue with a stranger about a controversial topic. They have less cardiovascular response if they're with a supportive friend present when they get the instruction. Okay? So if you're told you're going to do something like have a really unpleasant argument with somebody, but there's somebody you know with you who you know, you have less of a physiological response for the dread, if you want, or the stress of the upcoming event. And then those are controlled experiments, but there's epidemiological observations that people with spouses and close friends live longer, that when spouses die, the risk of dying increases for the surviving spouse, that parents of children killed in war, parents of children have a higher risk of disease and mortality, but only if they're divorced and widowed, that patients with severe coronary disease had 3 times the death rate of fires if they lacked social support. So these are all correlational studies. All of them would have the alternate interpretations, but they're all consistent with these experimental studies that social support is an incredibly powerful buffer for resilience, for stress, and threat. Here's another one, perception of life improving. So here's rats getting shocks. Rat number 1 got 10 hours a day. Rat number 2 got 10 per hour. Rat number 2 got 50 per hour. On day 2, all rats get 25 per hour. So rat number 1, life is getting worse. Rat number 2, life is getting better. And it's the group that goes from 10 to 25 that gets hypertensive. Okay? So if you think things are getting better, things can still be pretty bad, but if they feel like they're better, then you're going to be happier. As a side note, I should have put this in as a note, but there's work from Danny Kahneman on perception of pain. So he talked about people who went in to dentists, which can be sometimes unpleasant, and had them rate the pain periodically. And what he found is that when you look back in your memory of how bad your experience was, he can predict it largely by 2 numbers. The peak pain response you report, and the change near the end if it's getting better. So what he discovered is, weirdly enough, is this. If you have peak pain responses that are similar during a surgery, with a dentist, if you add more pain but it's getting lower, people will feel like they had less pain overall, even though you've added pain. Because if you just stop, it just stops. But now you add a little bit of pain, and it's getting better and better and better. So you're adding pain, but the perception is at the end it was getting better. Does that make sense? Okay, you're adding pain, but it's getting less and less and less, but it's just still an add because you're adding it. People, in their mind, they'll say it was less painful overall. Because what counts for them at the end is the getting betterness. Getting better, even if it's bad, is a hugely powerful way that people view things in terms of how miserable life can be. So here's a graph that summarizes, here's getting risk of ulcer in rats. If there's another rat present, if they give a warning signal for control, a lever for response, if things seem to be getting better, if they have friends, all these things change the physiological consequence of very rough stressors in the laboratory. And as far as we can measure, it seems to happen in people as well. So it's kind of a dual story, right? There's fantastic stressors that we have in daily life in the world we live in that are chronic and unabating in many ways, but quite well identified things that can help us manage those much, much better, or become victims of them much, much more likely. Okay. I'm going to talk a bit about a couple studies about pain and romance. Okay? So and this comes back to an idea we talked before, but let me just remind you this idea of embodied cognition, that the nature of the human mind largely determined by the form of the human body. That sort of bottom-up physiology has a bigger role in our mental life than we might think. And I'm going to talk about emotional pain. And two things that are very painful emotionally, and if you've gone through this, you know this. They're shockingly painful. Sometimes, if you haven't had it recently, are social rejection, right, or romantic rejection, right? It's a sad thing, but it's true that I think those are shockingly painful for many people, even if you didn't think it was going to be that bad. The shock of being rejected socially or romantically is a pretty brutal experience emotionally. I'm going to show you that from pretty strong evidence that it's because when you have that kind of pain, it literally turns on the same pain system as heat or shocks. Okay? Literally the same one gets turned on as far as we can measure it. So here's a thing just to remind you that pain can be comprised of having two parts: a sensory one that's the objective response to the pain, and what people call affective, that is how much you suffer from that pain. So we could measure the objective one and the subjective one. And a bunch of studies have suggested that, for example, somatosensory cortex, this is the cortex that represents your body, if you get physical pain, like a shock or a heat gun, responds to the amount of that, whereas something like the anterior cingulate, this part of the brain viewed from the top or this part of the viewed from the side, interprets that pain. So we know that people can withstand pain sometimes. We think this doesn't care about that. This is the part of your mind, or a component of your mind, is supported by this part of the brain that tells you how much you suffer subjectively from an objective pain. And part of the reason they think that is a study, a hypnosis study. So we talked before, is hypnosis real or not? This is one of the things that should convince you a little bit. I was as skeptical as anybody, but this has convinced me in part. So these are individuals who are highly hypnotic. Only those are in this kind of a study, who get pain, and they're told to imagine that the pain is more or less. The pain is always identical, right? It's always identical, but they're hypnotically suggested that it's high or low. So in this primary response to pain in somatosensory cortex, not much difference. But in the anterior cingulate, the interpretation of pain, a big difference. Here's how much it is when they think it's low pain by hypnotic suggestion. Here's the response when they think it's high pain. So this change in brain response is purely the hypnotic effect. The painful stimulus is always constant. All right? But that supports the view that this brain response is an interpretation rather than a simple objective response to the pain itself. Is that okay? All right. Now, there's many sources of evidence for that. So here's a study from Matt Lieberman at UCLA, where you come into a scanner and you're playing a game with somebody. Sometimes they tell you there's a person playing with you, and it's very simple. And it just shows you that even as adults, we retain some of our childhood feelings, which is it's a game of computerized, very simple computerized catch. And sometimes the person who's supposedly playing with you outside the room throws the ball back to you, and sometimes the person is really mean and they exclude you from playing catch on the computer. So I know this is about as silly a version as you can get for a young adult participant for pain, but hey, we don't like being left out, even when it's some weird experiment, and it's set up a little bit so you really believe the other people in the experiment have left you out of the ball tossing game. And here's how, and what turns on, right in the middle of this pain region, the anterior cingulate for the pain of social rejection under such a mild circumstance, okay? And by the way, if they do the same experiment and they tell you it's a computer who's deciding whether to toss you the ball, you don't have the problem. It's only when you believe it's a person who's choosing to exclude you, okay? So this was published in Science because they said, look, being left out of a group is as painful as if we had given you a shock or a thermal gun. And it can sound ridiculous, but look, it's the same system that's responding, okay? So just recently, a paper was published where they said, let's go all the way. This is just a little laboratory experiment. Let's grab people who recently self-report a very unhappy romantic breakup, okay, where somebody left them. So they gave them both physical pain, and they looked at its relation to romantic pain. So participants felt intensely rejected as a result of recently experiencing an unwanted romantic relationship breakup. What's the word we use for that when somebody, isn't there a word? Help me out here. Sorry? Dumped. Yeah, this is, when somebody dumps you, and oh my God, I'm really hurt. What's wrong with me? Okay. I'm sorry, it's easy to laugh about years later. I could tell you. I have a story or two, but I won't drag you into my but you don't have to have, almost everybody lives through a version of this sometimes in their lives. So, and it's surprisingly intense. So what they did is, this is a tough experiment. They had them view pictures of ex-partners, the person who left them, okay? I don't even know how they said, please bring us all the pictures that are now covered with tears and stuff, right? And, and you view those pictures, and they also had you bring in pictures of other friends, of people you knew, and you either thought about the ex-partners and how you were rejected, or you viewed pictures of your friends and you thought about good things about your friends. So they're controlling for looking at a face. And here's what they find. Here's physical pain and social pain in the anterior cingulate, pretty much turning on the same part of the brain. When you see the person who dumped you, and when you get a heat gun applied to you that exerts physical pain. And in brain region after brain region, that which responds to physical pain is also turned on when you have the pain of looking at somebody who dumped you recently and you still feel that feeling of rejection. So, we just, all of this is social rejection is very painful. Romantic rejection is very painful, and it's painful literally, okay? It's not a metaphor, it's not a story, it's literally the same system in your brain that feels physical pain, feels this emotional pain. So emotional pain is very powerful. And here's an amazing follow-up of this. I mean, this is the kind of studies where it'd be interesting to see if it gets replicated, but it kind of makes sense. So they randomly assigned people to 2,000 milligrams of a pain medication like Tylenol, Excedrin, for 3 weeks, or they got placebo. So you don't know what you got. It's a double-blind study. They provided daily reports of how their day was. By day 15, they reported less painful responses to rejection in their daily lives, and they also had less brain response to social rejection by taking drugs that work on pain. And they don't even know it. It's a double-blind comparison. Now, there's all kinds of issues for those of you, I just got to tell you this, to chronically take these drugs, you get ulcers and things like this. So don't do that. But it just pushes the point that there's some incredibly interesting relationship between emotional pain and physical pain that's very striking. OK, now I'm going to go on for the last few minutes to another topic. And again, it's one of these topics about racial relations in the US. That's always a very difficult topic in our culture, and I hope I communicate it correctly and appropriately. So we talked before about stereotype threat, and this is a threat that a person feels, because this is another form of stress, that others' judgments or one's own actions will confirm a negative stereotype about one's group, and that, for example, in multiple studies, that African Americans, when a test is framed about a kind of a test that people might think African Americans won't do well, do less well. When they just take the test, they do perfectly well. And that we talked about that whatever stereotype might apply to you, when it's invoked, people underperform in that area. And we interpret that as a sort of a stress that's not letting people perform at their best. So I'm going to talk about that stress element, but we're going to do an exercise. And again, I need you to be sensitive on this, and hopefully I'll do it, which is the most common way that psychologists measure attitude, something about the stereotypes that inhabit the minds of people who live in this country. So we're going to do it as an exercise. If you're willing to do it, you need to tap with one hand or the other. And we'll just try it. You don't have to do this at your desk. The first time, I read about this kind of research for a number of years before I ever did it as a demonstration when I was at a conference and somebody who works in this field did it. And it was kind of striking when it happened. So, it's up to you. Anyway, so think about whether you want to do this, but here's what we're going to do. So the experiment has two kinds of stimuli, basically. One of them are adjectives that are pleasant or unpleasant. So everybody agrees that murder or sickness is unpleasant. Everybody agrees that, cheer and peace are pleasant, right? OK? The second category of stimuli that are relevant are names that are selected in these experiments to be usually thought of, and of course it's a generalization, to be characteristic, found for people who are European Americans and more likely to be associated with African Americans. Okay? All right? I mean, you'll see the experiment has to work this way, but then I'll talk with you about other versions of it that don't depend on exactly this. Okay? It doesn't really matter. Well, you can think about things and ask questions in a minute. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do, I should do this, is this. You're going to see a list like this and tap of adjectives. Go from top to bottom and tap with your left hand. Sorry. if the word from top, if it's an unpleasant word, you tap with your left hand on your desk. If it's a pleasant word, with your right hand, from top to bottom. And I'll just read you the times as we go along from a stopwatch. Ready? So left hand if it's, here, look, sorry. If it's unpleasant, right hand if it's pleasant. Is that okay? Here we go. Go. Nine seconds, 10 seconds, 11 seconds, 13 seconds, 14, 15. Okay, all right, there's some practice effects in all this stuff. Okay. Now you're going to have the names. Tap with your left hand if it's a name, that's is more typical of an African American. Your right hand if more typical of a European American. Ready? Go. Five, 6, 7, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay. Okay. Tap with your left hand if the adjective is an unpleasant adjective or the name of an African American. Your right hand if it's pleasant or the name of a typical white American. Okay? So now it's a mixed list. Ready? Go. Five, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, so about 15 we got pretty much everybody. Okay, we'll do this now. Left for a name typically associated with, in this kind of an experiment, for a white American, right for a black American. Ready? Go. Eight, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay. Okay, and this is the last one coming up. So now it's going to be left hand if the unpleasant adjective or a white American name. On the right if it's a pleasant or a black American name. Ready? Go. Eight, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. Still tapping, right? All right, so this is a shock, right? If you don't know this literature, it's a shock. And it's a shock because this effect, which you heard yourself, happens in undergraduates across this country, people who are very convinced that racism is wrong, that they hold no stereotypes themselves, and they're definitely wrong that racism is wrong. They're definitely right about that. Definitely, don't foster stereotypes. I mean, you don't either. But an experiment after experiment in the country, and there's literally hundreds of these published, people on average are faster when they have to do unpleasant or black than unpleasant or white, as if it were easier to associate these two concepts. And what we just did now, with the easy condition, you were all done in about 15 seconds. In the more difficult condition, the unpleasant or white condition, there was still tapping occurring at 20. We could have gone at 25 or 30. Okay, so you had that experience too. I heard sort of giggling, and I think that's just kind of a shock, because you say, if you're like me, you say, I harbor no prejudices. How did this happen to me? So this experiment. And you can look up a lot of information about this from Mazhar Banashi at Harvard, who's sort of the leader of this with Tony Greenwald. They have a huge amount of evidence about this. So, one thing you kind of laughed at because it was so silly almost the way it was set up here were the names, right? Because it was kind of a funny list of names. I can tell you the experiment works identically just about if you show pictures of white or black people. So the names is not an issue in that case, okay? So it's a shocking thing. And where does it come from? That people are faster for white and pleasant than black and pleasant. That occurs in 75% of people who are white and about 50% of people who are black. So it's not as if black people reverse that pattern. It's just sort of even. And for whites, there's on average, for white people, they find it just easier to associate the white things with pleasant things than black names or faces with pleasant things. Yeah?
Was the experiment ever done the other way, where you would tap first for black and pleasant?
Yes, yes. So you are absolutely correct that in the demonstration I did now, I slightly loaded up the order of these things to make it work. But in the, no, absolutely. But, you know, why I give you this website is to tell you that in hundreds of experiments where that's all controlled for, by reversing the order half the time and stuff, it all plays out, okay? So the demonstration today slightly loaded it that way, but there's hundreds of experiments where it all plays out. And these numbers refer to the actual experiments where that's all equated out. People worried about whether the frequency of the names, that a name like Chip might be more frequent, common, than a name, you know, that's an African-American name just by sheer number. So that, therefore, the pictures gets it out of the equation. People have worried about lots of things about this. I think almost everybody agrees the basic phenomenon holds up under well-controlled experimental designs. That's an excellent question. Any other questions about this? It's a very disturbing thing. I mean, partly it shows you that stereotypes are out there, unfortunately, to this day. You know, even with an African-American president, stereotypes are out there in people's heads. Now, they used to call it the test of implicit attitudes, but now that people got a little, you know, is this really the attitude a person has in their head, or is it really they know about a stereotype that's out there? It's still problematic to have the stereotypes out there, even if it's not the one you believe and subscribe to or live by. Yeah?
Actually taking the test or the experiment.
Yeah.
And whether they found that it was more associating yourself, your own group, with the positive things.
No, well, no. So with African Americans, it's about 50-50 on average across them. So it doesn't reverse. It's not like my group is awesome, all other groups are, you know, not so awesome as my group because I'm in my group, right? It could be that, and that also would be problematic as much as anything. But it doesn't seem to play out that way. It seems to play out a little bit to what you might call, and this will change, my guess is to what is the dominant group in a society, okay? And now the US is changing in this regard, okay? But it's not changed yet. And you know, you get these kinds of things in lots of domains. We talked about that before. It's not just about black and white. But the last thing I want to show you, we'll be done in 5 minutes, it's just like 2 slides, is sort of a follow-up on this. So here's an experiment that was done at Dartmouth. And they had white participants complete this task that you just did under better controlled circumstances. So for each person, they could measure by how quickly they responded on the computer the difference between responding to black and white names in relation to pleasantness. So each person, you know, some person might be 10 milliseconds difference, somebody might be 200 milliseconds different. People vary. Then they had them go to a different room, and this is the critical thing. They interacted either with a black or a white experimenter. So all the participants in this experiment are white. Then they were told the reason you were doing this is that we want to videotape you making comments about the college fraternity system and racial profiling after 9/11. That was kind of a cover story, although the racial word was probably meant for them to think a little bit about the fact they just did the test you did. They go into a room, they interact with a black or white experimenter. Then they go back to the original room and they perform a cognitively demanding task, the Stroop task, where you have to name colors that are, you know, in the wrong color, which you've seen many times in this course already. And here's what they find. If you're a white person and you had a white experimenter, this is their performance on the Stroop task, and it's unrelated to how you did on the IAT test. This is the IAT test. The people who are more along here had a bigger gap between black and white, okay? So they varied. But look at the people who went in, took the IAT test like you just did, again, under more controlled circumstances. Now they go and do the Stroop and look at the more their score reflected knowledge of the stereotype, the more that knowledge of that stereotype influenced in some way their performance, that's along this axis, the worse they did on this sort of cognitively demanding task. As if, you know, the stress that harms performance is occurring on both sides of racial groups, right? We already said that stereotype threat can diminish performance for people when they're working in the area where there's a stereotype they're not supposed to do well. Just thinking about that diminishes their performance. And now for the other group, for the white participants, just thinking about the stereotyping, and you may have that too, just thinking like, what did I do? Why was I slower for that? I'm not a prejudiced person. How did I do that? The more their performance looked like that, the worse they did on this task, as if, again, now they had their part of their mind in the wrong place. They're over-aroused and underperforming. So that sort of everybody is falling victim on both sides of this perspective to these racial stereotypes. Whether you're black or white, it's disturbing to have that thought, and it diminishes your ability to sort of think clearly. So in that sense, stereotypes makes you stupider in performance on a cognitively demanding task. So there's so many forms of stress, and the one good thing is, the psychologists are getting better and better at discovering sources of resilience. And we talked early in the course, it includes resilience from stereotype threat. We'd like to just get rid of stereotypes today, but pending that, we've talked about things like essays and so on that have surprisingly brisk effects in these domains. OK, thanks very much.